students are energising, they make experienced practitioners reflect on their own practice. They become this pipeline for the workforce. So if we kind of spent time on feedback literacy, we'd probably get much better educational outcomes in clinical education. And I suppose one of the things that I think is most damaging when it comes to feedback is this idea of
Welcome back everyone to Curing the Curriculum. This episode was recorded in Melbourne, Australia on Wurundjeri country, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, their elders past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander among us. You probably know that moment. The supervisor gives some feedback, you nod, you leave the room, and you have absolutely no idea what to actually change. Today's episode is about why that happens and whose problem it actually is. Professor Liz Molloy started as a physiotherapist working with the Australian athletics team before turning her attention to something that quietly shapes every clinical placement: feedback. For 2 decades, she's asked not whether feedback is delivered well, but whether learners are actually equipped to use it. And she hopes to inform new ways of developing curricula, as she is the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Curriculum at the University of Melbourne. In episode 11, Rola Ajjawi told us feedback is not a form, but starts with a conversation. Liz asks what it takes for a learner to actually show up to that conversation ready. Liz, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Most of us likely have received a feedback sandwich in their career, the classic praise, criticism, praise. First of all, what is your favorite sandwich to eat? And what do you think about feedback sandwiches?
Okay, well, I did have a nutty chicken sandwich, funny enough, just about an hour ago. It was rye bread, so, reasonably healthy, and then walnuts combined with chicken. Am I a fan of the feedback sandwich? If you have read my work, you'll know that I'm not a fan. I like to kind of provoke why we should steer away from the feedback sandwich. Now, first of all, I think it's a model that is designed to help learners to not get too emotive and to kind of listen to the message or listen to the meat in the middle. And the problem with that is that it really kind of frames this dichotomy between positive and negative feedback. So essentially, if we take the definition that, feedback is information that the learner takes on, that they use to improve their performance, any type of feedback is productive if it helps people migrate in their understanding and their performance. So the idea that we need to soften feedback with these layers of flattery, these carbohydrate layers of flattery, I think is a real shame. It makes feedback quite tokenistic. Learners really get to anticipate the ritual. And I think whenever something starts to feel very ritualised, it can start to kind of tamper with the authenticity of the conversation. So I would love everybody to go paleo, to remove the carbohydrate, go for the meat in the middle, because that meat in the middle is what holds the educational value.
Okay, so even if it's rye bread, in feedback it's unhealthy.
Potentially. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't praise people or validate what they do well and why, but I do think we should challenge ourselves if we're using flattery, either side of hard-hitting feedback, as a way to make it more digestible.
So flattery or good feedback is fine, but not for the sake of delivering bad feedback.
Exactly.
Okay. So you have researched something called feedback literacy. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because that then doesn't use a feedback sandwich, right?
Yeah, sure. So, I've worked with colleagues. You mentioned Rola Ajjawi, David Boud, David Carless, Margaret Bearman, Joe Tai, and we've looked into Christy Noble, is another colleague who's worked on this deeply. And not to use a edu blah blah term. I think feedback literacy can be quite hard to access for students and also teachers alike. So I tend to like to use the term feedback know-how. And essentially what we're talking about is, how do students develop the dispositions, the knowledge, the understanding, the skills potentially to pick up and use feedback to their benefit? And, you know, if you like, that's something that students need to cultivate over time. It's not static, and, you know, I think we've had a fairly hard job in trying to crystallise what that might mean, what might it look like if you bumped into a feedback literate person. And if we've got a semblance of what that might look like, how would you go about cultivating it? And that's where curriculum comes in. How would you kind of scaffold it in a progressive way so that students can build up these dispositions and these, if you like, know-how to really navigate feedback for themselves?
So I'm a medical student. How could feedback know-how look like for me? So from your research, what is good feedback know-how and what is maybe not so good?
Yeah, sure. So I would say for yourself, for any medical student, if most students would think about feedback, being good at feedback, as being attentive and listening well and then taking on what that expert tells you to do. And to me, I think about the metaphor of rocking back on your heels and receiving something. In my mind, feedback literacy for the learner would look like coming onto your toes and getting ready to step forward to encounters, to conversations, towards data and meaning making. That means that you can milk that episode or that encounter for all its educational worth and use it so that you improve your understanding or you improve your performance. So I don't want to use the term agency, again a bit of edu blah blah, but there is a sense of volition and a sense of proactivity about how learners might step forward and navigate their feedback environment.
So it is all about actively seeking feedback information that lets you grow as a learner?
That's right, yeah.
And this sounds to me a bit like growth mindset, actively trying to find new information, seeking new perspectives, and volitional in the sense of that it is part of your doctor identity then as well?
Yeah, correct. I think that is a good way of framing it. The first thing you talked about around identifying sources, I think is a key component of feedback literacy. So often, medical students will orientate to a more experienced doctor. Mm-hmm. It might be what we call a registrar in Australia or a consultant or a direct supervisor who's involved in their assessment. And that will provide one perspective and a very good, important perspective. But I think part of feedback literacy that we've learned through our research is understanding what can patients add, what can a nursing staff add, what can a junior peer at the same level add, because they're more orientated to what it means to be a final year medical student. So that idea of who can tell me what about my performance in any one environment is a big part of this notion of feedback literacy.
That makes total sense, because I think we can learn from anyone around us, and that's very important. At the same time, I still feel like there's often this image still of having to be perfect, having to perform in medicine, that it's quite often tricky to be vulnerable and to admit I don't know. And also you might need to perform to a certain level if feedback gets used for assessment down the line. Let's say you have a feedback portfolio that gets assessed for a grade of an internship, for example. So I personally feel I often navigate sort of two types of feedback. Feedback that lives on the form, as Rola nicely summarized, and feedback aside from the form.
Yeah.
And I also feel like it is quite different what I ask. So I might often ask a doctor to give me feedback based on how I behaved, because that will satisfy the portfolio requirements. And from a patient or a peer, I could learn very different things. Is this what you also find in your research, that you should navigate different types of feedback differently? Should you let one of them go? Is it possible to do everything at once?
Okay, so all very big questions, 3 PhDs in one that you've just described. And so the first thing I would say that prompts my thinking, hearing your questions there, is this idea of the performative nature of feedback and assessment. And there is no doubt, it's human nature that if you're going through a clinical education program, you're on placement, you need to pass that in order to become a doctor, that you will behave in feedback encounters, in direct observation, even in informal banter around the wards. You'll behave in a certain way that perhaps paints you in a good light because you want to pass your exams and become a doctor. So, I do think we need to acknowledge that idea of people wanting to look good and look shiny, and that can butt up against or create a tension with this idea of feedback literacy, where we do want students to be vulnerable. We want them to let it all hang out. We want them to disclose their deficits, what they need to do to improve. So I don't think we're ever going to burst that tension or resolve that tension. I think there will always be, and necessarily so, there will be an awareness of who is assessing me and how much should I reveal to that person who holds the power. What that does mean is that it opens up a great opportunity for example, for same level peers to give each other really honest feedback. And we know that even with near peers, that often it's those informal conversations that are very generative, because you're prepared to ask the silly questions, you're prepared to talk about what's keeping you up at night, you're prepared to ask questions, probing questions with your peer. And perhaps I think currently in medical education we're not exposing or we're not harnessing that value of near-peer feedback. The second thing I'd say from the questions you just asked was that different people will have different perspectives on your performance. And we don't want to really cultivate a generation of doctors who are seeking to triangulate what their real performance looks like by asking patients and physiotherapists and other staff. What we do want is to cultivate medical students and graduates that understand that if they really want to understand the value of their communication, whether it's tailored, whether it's sensitive, appropriate, the patient is the person to ask. If you really want to understand what your handling is like when you put your hands on a patient, only the patient can give you that first-hand feedback. Your supervisor can make deductions about how it might feel, but they're not in the hot seat. So we're really trying to train our students to understand who can give you perspectives on what aspects of your performance, and therefore, what does that mean in terms of how you navigate your feedback environment?
And there's also a certain hierarchy involved. I don't know how much hierarchy there is between doctors and patients in Australia, but in quite some countries there is also some hierarchy. Is there always very honest and valuable feedback from patients up to the doctor? Because I could also imagine under certain cultural context that a patient just says, yeah, it was all good, not really willing to speak out.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, you raise a great point that I think part of feedback literacy for a medical student is understanding those power dynamics in many different circumstances. So to use the chef in a restaurant analogy, if you tell a chef that the soup is terrible, well, you might expect that they take it into the kitchen, spit in it and bring it back. So I do think that medical students and indeed doctors need to be careful about, if they're asking patients for feedback, are they really prepared to hear it? What might the patient fear if they provide honest feedback that might kind of ruffle feathers in the doctor? So I think we need to be mindful of power. Likewise, we need to think about Are patients, how sick are they? Are they fatigued? Is it the right time to ask for that feedback? And then I think the other thing that many researchers are now exploring as well is that you probably wouldn't ask a highly technical question of your patient around a certain skill set. But when it comes to communication or organisation or empathy, that kind of domain is very much, in the realm of expertise for the patient.
Yeah, because the patient can also determine if they feel heard, for example, if you really heard their complaint well. So they're the expert in providing feedback on that, whereas, for example, surgical or technical skills, your supervisor would be.
That's right.
Yeah. So different types of feedback you would ideally collect from different people.
Correct.
So it's all about seeing the patient as an expert in one domain, your supervisor as an expert in another domain, and your peers as experts in a similar domain you are in.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the other thing to think about, often experts like a supervisor may be more likely to comment on highly technical skills, whereas a peer might say, Liz, I noticed you forgot to pull the blanket up back over the patient when you finished your assessment. So we do necessarily, depending on our area of expertise and how long we've been around the traps, we do tend to focus on different aspects of practice.
Yeah. You already touched on emotions earlier, and I wanted to come back to that. So emotions, we talked about the feedback sandwich to sort of buffer those emotions, but it sort of even backfires then. So what's the role of emotions with these different types of feedback? Is there, for example, less emotions involved when you talk to a peer, or is it a different type?
It's a great question, and we've been doing some more observational work around this idea of the intersections of emotion and learning and feedback. I think they're very intertwined. I do think we tend to simplify this idea of affect or emotion. And I suppose one of the things that I think is most damaging when it comes to feedback is this idea of supervisors trying to lighten the load or buffer the emotion on behalf of the student. And I'll give you an example. We've done some, actually it was part of my PhD looking at feedback in the workplace. We videotaped feedback encounters. And when supervisors were giving validating feedback on performance that had gone well, the transcripts were quite short, they were crisp. It was very much, you did this well because, and this is why you should keep it up. When they provided what some people may call negative feedback or constructive feedback, the transcript, trebled in length, and there was a lot of what we would call mealy-mouthed feedback. A lot of fillers, a lot of, you may want to consider if it's the right time for you, perhaps you should think about. So almost an apologetic stance when people were providing clear feedback about what did not hit the mark. And I think there is something really patronising about that. It almost is like a form of stigma that, you shouldn't be receiving constructive feedback about the gap between your performance and the standard of performance. So I suppose that's where the opposition is to that kind of, vanishing or mealy-mouthed feedback is it's hard to decode. How on earth do I hear the message in that big, long transcript? But secondly, this kind of almost implicit stigma that I'm getting all mealy-mouthed and tangling myself up in knots because I don't think you're capable to hear the message, which is a really clear message, which is about improvement. You talked about the growth mindset before. If we all make the assumption that whether we're an experienced professor or consultant or a first-year out doctor, we've all got a growth trajectory, then we should all welcome feedback. There's always a gap, or most often there's always a place to grow. So I think it's mysterious that we get very tied up in knots when we want to communicate that message.
Yeah. So it's important to have those harder conversations as well, because I think there's the most room for growth. I also think there's nothing worse than receiving on my feedback forms, going well, keep going,
Yeah.
which is quite often, but it's not very specific and it doesn't really help me to improve further. So I think a student can possibly also invite that and say, well, give it to me straight, right? I would say, right, you, but I can still imagine that then still negative emotions arise when you suddenly hear, well, I haven't really been performing up to standard or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Is there also something, aside from inviting very direct feedback, that students can do to deal with these emotions that might arise?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think part of, if you're a supervisor, part of holding the space for someone you're having a conversation with is about acknowledging the likely emotion that might be coming up. There's also what we found in our research is a distinct lack of revisiting the conversation. So if there's a difficult conversation with a high emotive kind of valence, to me it would be human nature that you'd say, that was a tricky conversation, might have been difficult to hear. Shall we check in tomorrow and see how you're sitting with that? The value of that is it does give people time on their own to kind of digest it. Sometimes you just need time to sit with those emotions. The other thing that we find, and a colleague, Leonie Griffith, has published a beautiful paper on this in academic medicine about dealing with difficult emotions. What people tend to do, medical students tend to do, is to seek meaning making through what we call side loops. So different conversations, it might be with a parent at home, it might be with a partner, might be with a student on the way home on the train. But it's those side loop conversations that help learners to kind of normalise those emotions, to make meaning of what's been said. And it creates a really nice avenue for when you reconvene and say, we had a difficult conversation yesterday, how's that sitting with you? Have you anything dropped in or dropped out or escalated for you? Let's talk it through.
Sleeping a night also with big decisions and so on is very valuable, I think, because you wake up with a fresh perspective. And also what you say, I recognize, is sort of debriefing, feedback, hard conversations, also clinical encounters with your partner at home or your peers. It can be valuable. I guess also it is different, someone who hasn't been there, than someone who has been there and who has seen the actual situation. So I also see some risks, possibly, because what I'm referring to maybe is also trying to place the supervisor. Is this a good supervisor? Is this a bad supervisor, or somewhere in between? This is at least what I notice as a student, is one of the first questions medical students tend to ask each other or tell each other about is who at this ward gives good feedback. Right? And then usually that's for the performativity, sort of like how can I easily get my field notes checked off. But also like who can I really talk to, be vulnerable with, and who isn't really open for this sort of education. And this is quite interesting how students navigate this and share this information. But that sort of reminded me of that.
That's right. And there's some beautiful work by Damien Castanelli, another Australian, who's looked at the role of trust in supervisor-student relationships, particularly when it comes to workplace-based assessment. And his work really investigated that idea of what the trainees, how they start to build a view of whether their supervisors have their best interests at heart or whether they're people not to be trusted.
And I assume this is some sort of gut feeling, tacit knowledge you build, or what does that look like?
A very good question. So what Damien found through his research is that trainees, they talked about initial trust, which is, by virtue of Liz being senior and obviously being around the hospital for a long period of time, looking like she's very collegial, then probably she's a person to be trusted by virtue of role. But then there's what Damien talked about as kind of earned trust, which is much more experiential. It's that idea of, if I am vulnerable with Liz and I bring up some deficits or things that I'm worried about, does she shoot me down and give me less access to patients, or Does she listen? Does she build on that? Do we continue to establish rapport? Is she vulnerable back? So a bit like that idea of, if I put my toe in the water and it gets snapped off, I'm not going to put my whole leg in the water. So a lot of that trust is highly experiential, and it's about learners actually tracing the effects of those dips into vulnerability.
And that's a relationship you need to slowly build or experience with every supervisor, so that it just takes time as well.
Yeah, that's right. But I do think there's an interesting literature around maladaptive responses to feedback, and more so sort of in the organisational psych literature. But that idea of, if you receive feedback information that really kind of messes with your view of how you see yourself in the world, that can create turbulence. And one of the ways that learners can seek to remove that turbulence and make themselves feel better very quickly is to shoot down the messenger. So one of the maladaptive responses to feedback is to blame or seek to dent the credibility of the supervisor or teacher. We hear things around, she only watches me when I do badly, or she's always had it in for me, or she doesn't like my boots, whatever it is. So it is something that I'd be cautious of, is trying to initially shoot down the messenger and just sit with the discomfort.
Because even if someone were to have bad intentions, there's probably still some truth in the feedback. And I think usually in healthcare, most people really want to help other people grow and become better healthcare professionals, at least in my experience.
I totally agree. And I think occasionally you will get colleagues or supervisors that might be misguided or have a really bad day and are not professional. So, I think that is the value of having those side loop conversations is, if people say, that sounds really not professional, or I can't imagine someone saying that to me on the ward, it can also kind of validate your own position.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about also possibly revisiting feedback the next day or at another time. And what I found as a student, that would be great, but also quite often there's not really time for feedback. So it's also tricky to find the right moment to ask for feedback. Sometimes you can sit down, have a half-hour conversation, but sometimes there's simply no time. How do we deal best with that? So when do you, as a student, you push really for feedback, you go for it because you need it, and when is it also good to let it go and maybe not ask for it?
I think that is the million-dollar question, and the work we're doing currently, we're doing a study at the moment at this university, and just to quickly frame the study, so we've developed a feedback literacy intervention for medical students. It's a bit like an OSCE, so it's a 4-station experiential task. And instead of the task being about taking blood pressure, it's about feedback seeking. It's about multi-source feedback. It's about a difficult conversation. So the standards of practice are all centred around feedback. So our students go through that program, and then we've interviewed them when they go out onto placement about how have they been able to translate this kind of feedback literacy, and what do they find really difficult despite this sort of priming educational activity. And the thing that they are talking about that they consistently find difficult is how to kind of butt in and, if you like, generate these feedback episodes when their supervisors are so clearly busy and the primary objective is patient care. And what I would say is that ability to read the room or to read the world is part of feedback literacy. It is understanding when is the right time to interrupt. They talk a lot about, am I going to look indulgent if I'm consuming David's time when he's clearly busy with patients? They are really difficult micro decisions to be making on the fly, and you have to practice them. So part of this feedback intervention is about giving students the language to, bring, is this an okay time for you? Or you're walking up the stairs with a supervisor, you're about to do an assessment of a patient, and you might say, Margaret, I would really value your opinion on my examination skills of the gastrointestinal system. I find I'm a little bit clumsy when I move on to the gallbladder. That's where I'm just struggling to palpate. That kind of thing, priming your supervisor to watch for certain things and to give you feedback on certain aspects of your performance is a really clever thing to get a handle on. And if you can do that in between patients or in the stairwells or at the coffee briefing in the morning, much better than to stop someone, yank them back from patient care and say, can you please give me feedback?
Because then they're also primed to look out for a certain thing. So if you have one learning goal during that day, they will look for it and they will probably give you also better data than when you ask them afterwards and they didn't really pay attention maybe to that specific aspect, right?
Exactly. So if you're a feedback literate student, double tick to you if you can say, I would love you to watch for A and B in my performance. Yeah. And I suppose one thing I'd say, that necessarily creates a little bit of vulnerability for you because you're probably going to ask for feedback on an aspect of your performance that you are still developing. Yeah. So it takes a kind of mature student and a reasonably kind of confident student to bring up those vulnerabilities that you want your supervisor to hone in on.
Yeah, and I think that's a difficult calculation to make, at least from my context, between trying to really find those growth moments, be vulnerable and learn a lot. Because at the same time, if you're a bit clever, you can just find the supervisors and a bit of an empty thing to ask feedback on to just get a good grade and pass the internship. I think as a student, you can pretty much do both paths or a combination of both. But yeah, I think it's in the end a choice for your own learning.
Yeah, that's right. And there's quite a lot of literature about gaming and how you game the system and this idea of sort of performative assessment. I do think it gets sniffed out a bit like on the soccer pitch when someone goes down and, grasps their head when their knee was knocked. If it doesn't feel authentic, I think people will cotton onto it. But there is a strategic approach to learning, I suppose, where you, as a learner, understand, here's my learning ecosystem. If I'm feeling vulnerable, if I've just arrived day 2 on placement, I might be really well served to ask my peers and my near peers for feedback and perhaps preserve a different type of conversation for that supervisor, mindful that I'm making a first impression, but still really wanting to learn from them.
Yeah. I always feel a lot of pressure to also just pass the internship. So something I've decided for myself later when I'm in a supervisory position is to tell maybe a new intern in the beginning, look, you're here to learn. Please feel free to be vulnerable. We're not going to take this as a reason to not let you pass this internship. You're really here to learn. So please take all the opportunities you can along the way. And we're also happy to provide you with those opportunities. Is this a good idea? Or is this?
It is indeed, yeah.
Okay.
And we've spoken to quite a few supervisors who have done some longitudinal interviews with us as researchers about that approach. And if you like, that kind of explicit conversation at the start of placement around this is how we value feedback, here's the kind of philosophy of supervision, that it probably does make a difference. The caveat is, it's helpful if you follow through. It's a bit like saying, trust me, wink. It's actually my actions that you start to earn that trust. So, I think probably what we've found in our research is that the modelling that goes on in the actual workplace is the most, persuasive type of coaching you can do. And by modelling, I mean if a doctor is routinely asking for feedback from their patients, from nursing staff, from juniors, that is the type of invitation for a student to be more vulnerable and to sort of seek and use feedback.
So leading with that vulnerability themselves. I would love to come back to that. So I think also, because we talked a little bit about that feeling of guilt, having to ask time for feedback when you see the pressure on patient care.
Yeah.
So I think also if you explicitly invite it as a supervisor, you might remove or reduce the amount of guilt of a student asking time. So I think that's already an added benefit as well.
Yeah.
But so the modeling part I find very interesting, because I've had 1 or 2 internships where after the end conversation and after the grade was determined, I was asked, well, do you have any feedback for us as a department? And those were usually really incredible conversations, because as a student, you come with a fresh perspective. Of course, you don't have the medical knowledge of the medical specialist, but you might see things in the way they run the department, in the way they provide learning opportunities, and especially being able to compare to other departments in the same hospital or other hospitals. Students can often share quite a lot of information if they ask. I mean, it's often not the place of the student in the hierarchy of medicine.
Yeah.
But I think students also generate information that supervisors need, right?
Indeed, yeah. And as you say, that direct invitation for feedback is going to be very important because of the power asymmetry. You know, I also think there's, going back to that idea of structural power, if you want a job back in that department when you graduate, sometimes you might be slightly restrained about what aspects of feedback you provide the department. So there's a degree of, again, of reading the world when you respond to that invitation. And I do think there's still room for, you know, feedback back to the university, as an example, depending on what country you're in and the kind of the governance of clinical education. But, you know, the kind of feedback you provide directly to supervisors might be different to what you provide back to the university, that may have a kind of a different relationship with that partner. But indeed, you know, a thriving feedback ecosystem should be one where you can imagine the lines being drawn between all the different parties. It is something that should be normalised, and it is part of a learning ecosystem.
Yeah, so feedback network. So is the reason we don't really have that yet, or we need to maybe work towards this, the hierarchy, so that we what you might call do feed down. We always give feedback to someone in a lower hierarchical position, and we should actually invite the feed up, so feedback going upwards. Exactly,
and we had a supervisor who used a term that really it kind of shocked me, but I completely, it resonated when they said it. They said something like, he was saying, as a senior doctor who's qualified, a consultant, he doesn't get a lot of feedback up because people see him as the finished article. And I think that's really sad. You know, this idea of if you get to a point in your trajectory, everybody thinks that you know, expertise is fixed, you've made it, and therefore you're immune to these kind of feedback inputs and feedback conversations. So then if that is not happening organically in the workplace, and we plonk a medical student in who's had all these amazing feedback OSCEs and workshops about giving and receiving feedback, but there's actually nothing happening in the real world, that becomes a disconnect. And we know that the most persuasive part of workplace learning is what we call, you know, culture. This is what we do around here.
Yeah, this is the way we do things around here. Yes,
yeah,
indeed.
That's right. Yeah,
indeed. And you've also done some research, if I'm not mistaken, on the framing of sort of clinical placements. So very much that we see it as students come and they receive something, they take something, and the department needs to provide certain things. So what have you found, and how should we look at it, like at the student contribution going into a placement?
Yeah, so that's this is a study we did through the medical deans of Australia and New Zealand, and it was looking at what do students, when they go out on placements, what do they contribute through their role as learner. And as you said, the kind of discourse out there, or the literature, is about the student as burden. And our own students are talking about that. They're talking about, you know, I'm a burden for the supervisor. I drain their cognitive load. I ask them for feedback when they're busy. They're about to have a cup of tea and I ask them, how do you put this IV line in? So it was really interesting. That was an observational study. And we really were watching for what do students add through their role as being a student. Lots of things that you could imagine. Obviously, the first one is a pipeline for the workforce. So that's a clear value for hospitals and general practices. The other thing it tends to do is get people up and about. When you have really clever people like yourself doing MDs and PhD combined and people that are IT savvy, AI savvy, they come into your environment and they ask you clever questions that puts you on your toes, that makes you think about all these default practices that you haven't thought about for a while. It's energising. So, you know, I think that study really showed that students are energising, they make experienced practitioners reflect on their own practice, they become this pipeline for the workforce. But they observe things about senior clinicians' practice that senior clinicians might forget about. And I gave you that example of there was a ward round in this particular study, and they were moving from bay to bay to each patient. And the consultant moved on, and it was the student that stayed behind and answered the questions that the family members didn't understand from the consultant, and also put the blanket up and preserved the dignity of the patient. So it was it's almost like they acted as a bridge between the layperson and the sort of expert that kind of forgets what it's like to be a patient in a hospital. And I think that's kind of a glorious position.
Yeah, that is amazing. So you are sort of caught in the middle, but you can then act accordingly and really make a difference.
Leverage that capacity of being the bridge.
Yeah, and I've felt like a burden to the team a few times. So I really recognize what you say. So it's great to hear that learners don't just consume something, but they can really contribute, or they do actually contribute, and they should also feel that they contribute. Is there a way we can invite this as supervisors, as educational institutions? Is this just for students to go in and be proactive with feedback and contributing?
So that is a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure. So this is kind of what we're trying to figure out through this program of research at the moment. You know, I think the worst thing we could do in terms of this whole learner feedback literacy movement is to say we're actually changing the distribution of responsibility onto the learner, and it puts the teachers and the supervisors and the hospitals off the hook. That's definitely not what we're proposing. But I think what we're saying is feedback is such an important mechanism in workplace learning. We're curiously kind of casual about how we prime our learners to go in and to kind of navigate these feedback processes. So if we kind of spent time on feedback literacy, we'd probably get much better educational outcomes in clinical education. So part of that is priming of learners. The other thing is really, I suppose, priming of supervisors to, and you gave some great examples to say, you know, welcome Liz, this is how we do feedback around here. We'd love you, before you go in and do an assessment, I'd love you to tell me one or two things that I could focus on as a supervisor when it comes to our feedback afterwards. You know, it is busy in here, but we're going to try to have a conversation at least twice a week. Let's pitch for Wednesdays and Fridays. That'll at least give us some cleaved off time to have a feedback discussion. And then, as you know, last day of the placement, we'll go through your assessment form, we'll give you a rating, you'll rate yourself, and we'll come up with 1 to 2 things that we think you could take forward to your next placement. So kind of setting those boundaries. But, you know, I think the other thing that I'm really excited about with the work we're doing with Rola Ajjawi and Margaret Bearman and Christy Noble and colleagues is this idea of being a bit more critical of the actual workplace and the socio-material, and thinking, where could you have a feedback conversation? And you know, a good example would be in surgery, that when people are scrubbing up before an operation, that's a really good time to have that discussion about what do you want to try today? When do you want me to take over? What do you want me to watch for in particular? Likewise, if you're closing the wound and the stakes of the operation are lowered, that could be a really good time for a feedback conversation.
So it's all about timing, but also maybe not just getting feedback from the surgeon, but maybe also from the anesthesiology team, the rotating nurses and so on, the operation assistants, anyone who can give you information.
That's right, but also even thinking about the physical space. If a lot of feedback happens in the change room after an operation and you're a woman surgeon with a male trainee, you might just wipe out your feedback. So thinking about how the physical spaces of the workplace may facilitate but also constrain those feedback conversations.
So that is the socio-material aspect of it. So the OR might be too high stakes, or after a heavy day you might actually say we'd rather debrief in the office or in the change room or somewhere else, because that would change the type of feedback you receive?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've had some interesting examples of proactive trainees that will really use the stairwells in between level 2 and level 5. That's where I get the best feedback of the day.
Yeah.
When I'm chasing the consultant up the stairs.
Yes, or getting them, what I love to do is getting them a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. It's a little nice gesture. I'm doing something for you, maybe you can do something for me, but it also helps create a nice bit of relaxing time, because I think the conversations that happen over a cup of tea or coffee are more relaxed and honest than the ones just very quickly between patients when you just focus on the bare essentials.
That's right. And going back to the hidden curriculum, these are the types of things you don't see in the medical education textbook, but it is about navigating your environment, picking the spaces and the timing that means that you can kind of navigate these conversations, but even pick up the cues in your physical environment that give you a sense of how you're performing. So, a raised eyebrow is a cue. Someone putting up their hand and saying, I'm too busy, stop there, is a cue that perhaps you didn't pick the best moment to interrupt. So we want to try to, if you like, prime our medical students to really look for those both informal cues as well as kind of entering and contributing to conversations themselves.
Great. Thank you. Many things for me to think about as a medical student, where and when and how to ask for feedback and what to do with it, and when also to offer feedback back. Maybe, because we spoke about a lot of things to revisit, if you could change one thing about feedback in medical education and it would be changed tomorrow, what would that be?
It's a very difficult ask. One thing that I would love to see, and I say this because I think there is nothing more persuasive than practice itself. I'd love to see kind of seasoned doctors and nurses and actors in the healthcare system normalising giving and receiving feedback as part of work in the everyday, so that when learners come into that environment, that they see that that is part of normal practice. I think it's a really difficult ask to try to kind of socialise and graduate these medical students with these sort of feedback skills, but they're kind of not seeing how it's done in practice. That's, that's a big wish. On a kind of, on a different scale, something that we can manipulate a little bit more within the curriculum itself is really, I suppose, preparing students before they go onto placement about how they can access conversations, give them language, and I don't think we do this enough. We often give students principles of feedback literacy or principles of a feedback model. It's very different from actually putting those words onto the tongue, spitting them out, seeing what the effect is. So I'd like to see more rehearsal, and it might be kind of simulation-based rehearsal on how to sensitively interrupt people who are busy, how to be really precise when you're in a feedback conversation. If someone says, "Great job, Liz, keep going," how do you probe it further? What was it about the work that was good? Could you give me an example? and just try to give learners the confidence to have a bit of a repertoire of phrases that can help them to access these more meaningful feedback conversations.
Amazing. So also making sure you really get the information that's there. Because I think what I take away from this conversation, the information is there from the perspective of the patient, the nurse, the seasoned doctor, but it's all about getting to that information, and how you get there is key.
That's right. And of course, you know, through hanging around for a long time, through trial and error, this is practice. This is the world of praxis, where you start to be able to, you know, find those cues and make sense of them. If we can be a bit more explicit up front, we can help learners to navigate those cues.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you very much. Do you have any feedback for me?
Well, I mean, given we're on air, I've got to. I should really practice what I preach. Of course, I would ask you, how do you think you went? But let's go straight to the point. I found that a really really interesting chat. It really helps you reflect on. You know, when you say things like your two big wishes, it gives you lots of pause for reflection, and you're obviously very well read. Through the very nature of the questions you asked, I can tell that you're well immersed in the literature. So thanks for all that prep.
And thank you for breaking it down with very visual examples, like dipping your toes in the water, or the chef in the kitchen and the soup. Now I hope they don't spit in the soup, but it makes it very clear on how these mechanics work. Thank you.